So look at what's just landed at my desk. It's the MSI MPG321CURX, a 32-inch, 240Hz QD-OLED gaming panel that we did a YouTube short on during CES 2025. And they've just asked us if we wanted to take a look. And yes, of course, I said absolutely, get this thing on my desk now. And here it is in all of its glory, sitting pretty next to my 27-inch screen here. And yes, I know I haven't got enough space to mount the 32-inch screen onto the wall, so I've opted to put it on its lovely stand for now, but we move. So this thing, as you can see, is an absolute beast. And as soon as I could, I got it onto the desk and was zipping around some Overwatch 2 and just basking in color. Well, tell a lie, I did try and launch Indiana Jones, but that failed miserably as that game's a little bit finicky to run. I've never had a smooth time with that game. It's got a 240Hz refresh rate, and its variable refresh rate gave me some very nice and smooth images, and the fact that it is G-Sync compatible too helps, though it is still only activated within that minimum 48 Hz and upwards range, so it's not technically a G-Sync monitor, but it is compatible. I have played some Hollow Knight on here as well, and my gosh, the contrast on that game with the inky blacks and the bright character and effects, it just looked really sharp and wonderful. The image is super sharp here, and really when either gaming or watching media, I couldn't really fault it. And again, content on Netflix, though not in HDR, or I'm not watching in HDR anyway, is still nice and sharp and vivid and very colorful. It's just an all-round amazing experience, and OLED gaming is just so good now. And whether it's here on a 16:9 panel or ultra-wide, I just love it. And the fact that this panel is curved too gave me a bit of immersion, but at the very least, it's good for the peripherals if you're looking at the center of the screen. Testing the monitor brought back a range of results. I will say this, depending on the monitor settings I decided to use, and the biggest disparity was with its color gamut and color accuracy. In its default premium color game mode, the monitor achieved a color gamut of 100% sRGB, 95% Adobe RGB, 98% P3 gamut, and an average Delta E score of 3.65 and a maximum of 7.46 on its color accuracy test. However, within this game mode, you are getting a much more saturated image, like the ones you see being used inside of games like Warzone and Overwatch 2, which helps with things like enemy placement, as red looks a lot more saturated to the eye, or at least that's what you see on streaming platforms anyway, like Twitch. Moving on to testing the user game mode, it garnered much better results when it came to color accuracy, with an average Delta E of 1.26 and a maximum of 1.92. And I must say I did leave it on this setting for the duration of my testing, as it gave the most accurate color results. However, the other image settings were not too far off this figure. The color gamut, however, still set at 100% sRGB though. Adobe RGB slipped to 94%, big deal, and which is negligible anyway. And the P3 gamut still sat at 96%. However, in the sRGB mode, color gamuts took a turn for the worse, because of course they did, because this mode is all about making your image best for sRGB gamut. So that sat at 100%, though Adobe RGB did really sink down to 75% and P3 down to 77%. Color accuracy did remain strong though, with an average Delta E of 0.98 this time and a maximum of 4.6, which is a bit of a wider range, which is close to the user profile tested, although that range was slightly larger. And the last test I did run for this was the Adobe RGB profile, which saw 100% coverage of the sRGB gamut and 95% coverage of Adobe RGB and 95% of P3 coverage and 91% NTSC. Color accuracy also remained on point 2, with an average Delta E again of 1.26 and a maximum of 1.92, so very, very much the same, on par with the user profile. So between the two, you're not really going to get much difference. Moving on to brightness and contrast, at 100% brightness, I achieved a 16,000:1 contrast ratio and a white point of 6,200. It is a Display HDR 400 compatible display. Turning on HDR inside of Windows 2 meant that my brightness setting on the monitor really messed up and grayed out. And although contrast did look great inside of games, and also watching a bit of media on YouTube, I couldn't get using the equipment here an accurate reading, as I was locked out of all of my settings. So take that as you will. Now, I did just want to mention, because unfortunately this is after the fact and the monitor isn't on my desk anymore, but despite me not really ever being too much of a fan of HDR in the first place, this is by far the best implementation of HDR I have seen on a gaming panel. And thinking about it, it's probably down to that 1000 nit brightness settings that you can select inside of your settings menu. But when watching HDR content, it was just really so contrasty, and it was just a really lovely experience, and the colors really popped. Color uniformity at both 50% and 100% brightness was decent enough, though there was a bit of a hot spot towards the bottom right hand side, which was a little bit of a letdown, though the majority of the image was great, and to the naked eye, you're not really going to notice this anyway. And when it came to luminance uniformity, again at both brightness settings, it was absolutely flawless. Using my OSRTT tool, the results were as expected really, and inside of the 96.67% in window, I found the average initial grade to grey time to come in at 1.16, which is astounding but not really outside of the realms of OLED and other panels that we've tested recently. And with such little to no RGB overshoot, the panel is such a performer. And this even extended to a UFO ghosting test, where at 240Hz, I pretty much saw no ghosting to the naked eye. It is clear MR 1300 rated, which is decent and proves that the monitor has gone through some pretty strict testing, but I will say that by dropping it down to 120Hz to match the types of refresh rates that you could get on a games console, PS5 for example, the monitor still managed to keep the ghosting almost non-existent really, but the little UFO characters did start to produce a little blur, which is expected. There was absolutely nothing wrong here, I would say, with the way that this monitor handled ghosting whatsoever. So the bezels, as you can see, I think are a little bit chunky, and that's all I really want to say about that. It is bezel-less by design, which is nice and premium looking, but they are just a little bit on the larger side. It's also a little bit chunky around the back as well, because it's got a custom heat sink designed to keep the screen from getting too hot. I get it, I really do. And you see these TVs now with really, really thin screens with these chunky bits at the bottom, and OLEDs must get hot and the heat has to go somewhere. I mean, the monitor doesn't need a cooling fan, so I'm all for it. No more whirring on the desk from a monitor, although I've never heard a monitor whir. It does make wall mounting somewhat a bit of an issue, and although it has got a 100 by 100 VESA mount, the monitor can protrude a bit from the wall because of that chunky heatsink. It's got a really skinny stand, which looks great and very minimalist compared to the bulkiness of the screen, and while yes, it does take up some decent real estate on the desk, as you can see, even though I've got it hooked up to my gaming rig like this in front of my wall-mounted panels, it can still fit my keyboard or my Stream Deck Plus underneath it, and it can be height adjusted and tilted and rotated as well. The rear arm is pretty thick and it looks great, but it is definitely hidden a lot of the time by this monitor. Around the back, you have got a pretty simple I/O with one display port, 1.4A, two HDMI 2.1 ports, capable of 4K at 240Hz. Like it says on the MSI website. You have got a USB Type B and two USB Type A ports as a small USB hub and a headphone output. The monitor uses a kettle lead for power, which I know is a little bit silly to mention, but there is no power bricks involved here, so cable management can be kept to a minimum. And there is a small hole on the monitor arm, which can help feed the cables through the back of your desk included. It has got one RGB element in the center, which works with MSI's Mystic Light software, so you can change its colors and effects and that kind of thing, though it doesn't really glow bright enough to fill your wall, so I just left it as default. I also did quickly want to talk to you about the OLED panel care features here, because while it has got your standard pixel orbiting and refresh settings, it also does come with some very clever AI-esque features to do with the taskbar detection and logo detection, which will detect the shape of static images on your screen that have been there for a while and dim the pixels around that area to protect your panel from burning. Of course, I've not had this panel for extremely long term to know that if this works, but it's great to see that MSI are taking into consideration problematic areas on screens. And apart from this, there are some gaming features you may like a sniper scope, which puts a zoomed in area in the center of the screen so it's easier to headshot enemies, and even a built-in crosshair that you can turn on, and it will automatically change color depending on the color of the thing that you're aiming at. It's got some console settings for auto low latency and variable refresh rate and things like that, so it does a good job of jumping on the gaming bandwagon with its features. Now, this thing is a cracking monitor, and I say this every time that I see an OLED panel, but I'm unsure really on what else I could say. It looks amazing, and for gaming especially, paired with that 240Hz refresh rate, is super fast. Though it is 4K, and at 4K at the best times could be hard to really consistently run at a decent frame rate. You have got frame generation now, of course, that could take advantage on this, and again, it is game dependent. But if you're running through a game of Hollow Knight, then it will look amazingly smooth. Red Dead Redemption, though, maybe not so much. It will look stunning at 4K, but the FPS will suffer. It is a brand new monitor. As I said, we did look at it at CES 2025, and it cost a small fortune, coming in at £1,200 here in the UK when I Googled it. So yeah, it is a pretty penny for sure, but as far as gaming panels go, beautiful.